Welcome to the podcast, Whiskey and a Map. Stories of adventure and expeditions as told by those who live them. I'm your host, Michael Reinhart. It has been said that many adventures and expeditions start simply with a map and a glass of whiskey, a desire to go and see the world's wild places. You're invited to pull up a chair, pour yourself a glass of your favorite whiskey, and join us as we hear stories from another one of our friends just returned from the field. I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine, Wayne White. Wayne is a U.S. Marine veteran. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Geography at Cal State Fullerton and his MPH in Environmental Sciences from Tulane's School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. He worked for 20 years as a defense contractor specializing in assignments in remote areas. His personal expeditions have taken him to New Guinea, the Amazon, and Africa. Wayne has spent the last 3 years as the winter manager of the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. Wayne, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here, Mike.
Now, Wayne, podcast is Whiskey and a Map, and I understand that you have an affinity for Scotch. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do. I try not to start any earlier than like 7 a.m. or something that would be, no. Yeah, if I'm going to have a drink, it'll definitely be a Scotch.
And one of them is Shackleton, is it not?
Sure, certainly, yeah. I think many people will know the story about Shackleton's whiskey, that he left, there was a case or two of it that was buried at his camp there on the coast, dug up some years ago and then recreated. And I have a few bottles of that I actually come in various grades too. Most people don't know that. They think it's just that cardboard box. There's actually another grade of it where it comes in a little cardboard thing and it's wrapped in straw and it has some very cool stickers and things that go with it. And then there's the ultimate. It's actually in a wooden box that is marked British Antarctic Expedition 1907. And that's really cool. And there's only a few of those probably in the world around.
Is the taste different than you used to?
I have to see, I have never opened the box one, the wood box one. So I don't know if each one's a little different. They should be the same. They're supposed to be copies of his whiskey, but the prices are quite different from the cardboard box to the straw, the one wrapped in straw, to the one that's in the wooden box. Should be the same whiskey though.
And Shackleton had this particular blend made for him?
It's funny. Because I've had people, when they drink it, they say, oh, it was the best whiskey ever. And I think back, and I've got a book. There's a book out there, Shackleton's Whiskey. And I think my own feelings on it would be, if I were launching an expedition and I'm bringing whiskey and things with me, it wouldn't be the finest stuff. It would be what somebody donated, realizing that you got a crew of Navy guys and such down there. This isn't, it wouldn't have to be the finest stuff even back then. So it wouldn't be today either, but it does have a distinct flavor to it. They've recreated it doing some kind of a process. And that's not what this is tonight, by the way. Unfortunately, it's not. But I generally will save that thing for special occasions. And I was able to actually break it out the other day for something that occurred. Not that this isn't special, Mike. It is.
Nice. Wayne, you've spent a lifetime working in one form or another in some of the world's most remote areas. What led you to that calling?
That's a best question. It's easy for me to answer with a photo, which I don't have in front of me, but I think I sent it to you. That people will say, "Well, how did you get into this?" They'll come in my house, they'll see my collection. I don't know what they think. They think, what, at 20 years old, all of a sudden I had this epiphany that I want to explore the world. That stuff starts young. And I've got a photo of myself taken when I was 5, wearing a pith helmet and carrying a little plastic rifle and a pair of binoculars and it was a little explorer outfit. And I distinctly remember that thing. It was at a grocery store. I remember being 5 years old and going with my mother, and I wanted that so bad. It's the first memory I have of wanting something so badly, that little explorer outfit. And so they got it for me for Christmas, and there's a photo of me taken wearing that thing. The point I'm making is, I think in all of this, those things start young. They aren't something that happened later. Now, sometimes life intervenes and you end up going down a certain route. You have children, you have a family, you do these things, and then you become a lawyer or an accountant or something, whatever you do to make some money. But I still think that go back to when you were a kid, go back to those first dreams that are there, and they're in all of us. And in my case, it started way back then when.
You have the unique distinction of having died in the Amazon, or you're here to tell about it.
Yeah, it's a long story, and I'll just cut it short. It's a tragic story. It occurred many years ago in 1985. It was July, I believe, of 1985. And I was down in the Amazon for a short trip, and my whole purpose for being there was to collect a blowgun and poison darts. For some reason, I wanted a blowgun and poison darts. I'd researched where to get one, and I went down there. And one thing led to another. I ended up landing in Colombia. Colombia was a gateway for me to the Amazon. From Colombia, Bogota, down to Leticia, which is a little Amazon port that Colombia has. And I could talk for hours on this thing because it was the whole trip, although short, was an incredible situation. When we stopped at a place called Cali, Colombia, to refuel, and also we blew a tire there. Cali, Colombia was not a good place to be in 1985. And I remember, these were the Wild West, drug-infested, unbelievable, days that were occurring, and why I thought that was a good idea. But so many times in my life, I thought such things were good ideas. And so I'm in Cali, Colombia. I'm off the aircraft, and then they come up, they tell us Avianca has just gone on strike. We're on strike for indefinite period of time, but we'll take you to Leticia. We'll drop you off there, then whatever happens, happens. Flight continues. They fixed the tire. They took us to Leticia. I ended up going upriver in the Amazon, spending some time with some Indians. I picked up my blowgun and poison darts, and I met some very, very, let's just say, interesting people up there that were doing interesting things at that time for their, business. And fortunately, I think, is it drunks, dogs, and children kind of immune from being run over? Maybe Wayne fits in there sometimes too, because I was around some places I probably shouldn't have been, with some people that were very inquisitive of why I was there. But rather than a bullet in the head and thrown in the Amazon, I was transported downriver back to Leticia in a very nice speedboat. So, which I was very thankful for. But that's a story in its own right, what happened with those guys. But it doesn't matter. What I'm heading up to is I head back to Leticia. I've got my blowgun. I got my poison darts. I still got some time. I go through the little town. I can't get out. Avianca is still on strike. I go to this little shack building that's for the Avianca office, and there's a woman in there. And I said, I want to go on the next plane. And she tells me, okay, mañana. My Spanish was horrible. So I said, mañana, okay, I'm coming tomorrow morning. No, she goes, no. And she's telling me stuff in Spanish. My Spanish, again, is terrible. I don't understand what she's saying. She's saying mañana, but no to something or other. So I say, okay, hell with it. And I cross what I do is instead, I've got my pack still, my blowgun and poison darts and all that. And I head across the frontier into Brazil. At that time, there's no border. There's no checkpoint. You just, 1 minute you're speaking Spanish and the next minute you're speaking Portuguese. So you go, Buenos dias to something like Ben dia, something how they say in Portuguese. So I end up out in an interesting place there where a lot of farmers were doing slash and burn agriculture, and I make camp and I spend a little time there. And a day or so later, I come back into Leticia. And when I come back into Leticia, they're playing the music. It's a frontier, Wild West ass place. It's just a crazy little town. Gunshots at night, all this stuff's going on. And I come back to the town, and this guy sees me that I knew from the hotel I'd stayed at previously. He's screaming. He says, Senor Blanco. Wayne White, right? So, Senor Blanco, the American Embassy is looking for you. So why the hell would the American Embassy be looking for me? As I get more into town, I'm listening to the blaring music that's usually out on the street and all this that they're doing. And it's very somber music, very somber stuff. Well, I quickly put together what had happened. That flight that had taken off the next morning was an old DC-6 that had issues. It ended up taking off all right. And then about 10 miles out in the jungle, it crashed and killed everybody on board. There were about 75 people, and I was on that flight manifest. That woman was telling me was that it wasn't an Avianca flight, because I was asking her, was it Avianca? Is Avianca off strike? And she's saying, no. She wasn't saying you can't get on the flight. So I didn't really understand, thank God. So everybody's killed. I come back through town. I get quickly in contact with the American embassy. My wife out in California at the time. As they're identifying bodies, they're telling her I'm not one of them. I'm not one of them. And the people at the embassy were really super. Well, they were quite surprised that I called, actually. But when I explained what had happened, and the fact that I didn't realize to be at the airfield because she said no, but I was on the flight manifest. It took off. Everybody was killed. And then it was a terrible thing. So I was saved by my bad Spanish, and my Spanish is still really bad. That's a nutshell story. There's more to it.
So when it went down, they thought you were on it, and they were reporting you that possibly dead?
Oh, yeah. I got the newspaper. It's framed in the room behind here. It's a terrible newspaper. It shows the smoking hole in the jungle. It has a list of the passengers. And here's all these, South American type names, and then Wayne White on there, too, in the newspaper. So, it kind of goes with the rest of the things in the house. Everybody else is dead in here, too. So.
Well, thank goodness that your Spanish is that bad.
Never got better either, Mike.
In all of your travels, what is the most extraordinary, the most unusual thing you've witnessed? Something that you would have to see to believe?
My God, there's been so many. And for me to think something's extraordinary, there's so many possibilities in places where I've been. We'll talk a little about Indonesia, Irian Jaya, New Guinea. I spent 6 expeditions I did there in the 80s and 90s, and I witnessed some incredible things. I stood in some places probably no one's ever stood, or at least no Westerners ever stood. Let me qualify that. And, everything from a funeral and how these people had a funeral, out in the jungle and what they do, their rituals and all that, to another thing, which I didn't talk to you about, but I once in South Africa, I was always interested in the Zulu War. And I followed the route of the 24th Infantry on their way to their big battle at Asandawana and Rorke's Drift. And because I did that walk, which is around 120 miles, they let me camp on those battlefields. And that's probably a podcast in its own right, what happened on those battlefields, because they don't let people do that. And as I heard, particularly at Asandawana, they told me I'd never stay the night. I'd take off because they'd let a couple of Dutch guys a year before, and they'd left in the middle of the night. Well, I didn't leave, but let me tell you, I didn't feel it was an interesting experience. So I forget if you're trying to lead me into a certain thing that we might have talked about, but I've witnessed so many things that most people would probably find extraordinary, but after a while, to me, it seems normal.
Well, that's the good thing. It's usually, when I ask that question, every once in a while, somebody comes across something that they just have to scratch their head and you just can't really believe unless you saw it.
I probably have a lot of those things that people wouldn't even imagine, like crossing the mountains in New Guinea, in Irian Jaya, the Indonesian side, and things I saw with the tribal groups and such, and tribal wars, experience some of these things. Or, we're being on those battlefields, South Africa, particularly camped there, or just other things, out on the islands that I worked at, out in the Pacific, some of the things that I saw, it's just so many, it'd be hard for me to say, because again, my normal is so different than what most people's normal is. I think it's normal to walk in, to have a leech. There's a funny story, a funny story about humor. I put it on my Facebook page once, and I was trying to explain how humor is different with my wife and I, for example, and probably most of the world's probably different than mine. And a quick story. I was crossing these mountains from the interior of New Guinea, walking down to the Asmat coast. And we were on the rain side of the mountains, heading down into the coastal swamps. And we're in a place where it's just raining and terrible, and leeches. It's absolutely infested with leeches. And I get into this village in this rain shower. I'm covered in mud, and I decide I'll take a shower of the water pouring off a building and wash with it. And while I'm washing myself, I feel this thing on my eyelid, and I start pulling, and I get this thing out here like this. My eyelid is pulling out. It's a leech. It's stuck on my eyelid. So I'm pulling on this thing, which you normally wouldn't do. There's a way to get him off, but it didn't matter. He popped free, and then blood is running down my face, and I'm in this hellhole. The point is, I thought that was funny, and then my wife, that's what she would answer. You thought it was funny. So humor, just my life is different.
Yeah, when I try and explain those stories to people, they just look at me quizzically, and I just say, "Hey, it's brain damage."
Yeah, that's probably your best thing to do. Most people, sane people aren't going to think something like that's very funny.
You took, like you say, a number of trips to Indonesia and New Guinea, and it goes by various names. Why there?
Well, let me tell you, I'm a Marine for many years ago, and I always knew I was going to get out and do some exploration. And after I got out of the Marines, was in college, I was looking around. Well, hell, it goes back farther than that, probably movies that I'd seen and such. But I tried to find the place on the planet that I thought that was the most remote, and it was the island of New Guinea. And if anybody knows anything about New Guinea, that island, it's divided in two sections now. You've got Papua New Guinea and you have Irian Jaya. Well, they used to call it Irian Jaya. Now it's called West Papua, I believe, but it's Indonesian. Truly, that place is probably still the wildest on the planet. And because it's got this incredible, these people that used to eat people, for one thing. And then you've got this incredible mountain chain in the middle that creates amazing isolation. And then this swamp area that, absolutely detours most people from wanting to go to a place like that, with crocodiles and mosquitoes and snakes and all those things that most people don't want to be around. Well, I do want to be around those things. I did want to be around those things. So I picked New Guinea as a place to go. And my first couple of trips, the first trip I did was I trekked the Kokoda Trail, an old wartime trail in 1981. And after doing that it wasn't enough of the natural people thing. The missionaries had taken over the trail, and there wasn't much traditional stuff going on. So then I came back a few years later after being killed in the Amazon, and I hiked through part of Enga province, which is probably the wildest part of Papua. That still isn't very wild. There's roads and things that go through New Guinea, and people go there, and some of you people have probably seen the fantastic photos of the guys with, like the Huli Wigmen from the Southern Highlands. They got yellow face paint, and these people come back and claim they're, reincarnation of David Livingstone, with photos that were taken a mile from an airport while they were staying in a hotel. That shit's not for me. And so I went over to the Indonesian side and did 4 trips there. And that place was wild, especially in the 1980s still. Truly wild place. Now, your show, Whiskey and a Map. Whiskey and a Map. Well, I have both. I've got some very nice scotch. But it made me take out an old map, thinking about this ahead of time. And this old map, I've had it for many years. It's been in a box. I haven't taken it out. It's in bad shape. I got to do something about it. This old map was an air map. It was used by pilots in the 1980s, probably the 1970s. And what's cool about it, it's got these places on here, these marks on here that says that basically the topography is unknown. Now, maybe satellite has mapped it now, but back then they hadn't. And there's actually places on here that were unknown. They didn't know what the elevation was. And you can't probably see it, but you've got my marks through where I was on this thing. And on the trips that I did. I don't know where I was leading with that, but the point is, here's Whiskey and a Map, and here's a real map of some pretty tough trips to New Guinea.
Where is that island located?
Oh, it's north of Australia. It's north of Australia. It's pretty famous from the wartime, from the Papua side. Well, no, both sides actually. Wartime activity from World War II. I think it's the second largest island in the world. And what's cool about it is, because of its geographical features and very warlike people, it has been very isolated. And it has one thing they've said about it in the past, I don't know how it is these days, but that there were over 700 languages spoken there, because it's so isolated by these groups that they all develop different languages. And I saw that firsthand, trekking through and having problems going from one area to the other because of tribal wars and things that would stop people from proceeding. Very, very isolated place.
Is there one of those trips that's most memorable to you?
I mean, I'm going to tell you an interesting thing that happened. I was always alone for the most part. And the last 2 trips were very, very difficult. Crossing the mountain and getting down to that Osmat coast. It's hard for people to imagine now committing yourself to something where no one knows where you are. See, I rail against this modern stuff where everything's on the internet and you have sponsors and you do this and then you have, it's all this be me, look at me, self-aggrandizing, publicity stunt seeking stuff. These things, when I was out, I was by myself. No one knew where I was. No one knew, where I was headed. If something would have happened, that's the end. There is no finding or anything. No one would have probably known ever where I ended up. And when you do something like that, you make a major commitment that you're on your own. You don't have sponsors. You don't have support teams. You don't have any of this shit that I see in these modern supposed expeditions. You're just alone. But interestingly enough, one of the trips where I learned something was on my about third trip, took my wife to New Guinea and went on what I thought was a much milder, easy thing where she could just see, the place, and I thought she would appreciate it. And it was only about a 40-mile trek, and it wasn't through anything that I thought would be all that difficult. But what happened that was interesting with that was that I saw, when I march through, I go through these villages, it's quick and hard with the groups, guys carrying stuff. I'm not messing around. I'm not looking like an easy mark. I'm not looking like a lot of fun probably. And I keep that up, and I want, it'll stop a lot of problems just having that, having that demeanor that, you're not an easy mark, because these people think differently with weakness and such, and they wouldn't get it from me. But what I saw with her was the women would interact with her. And with me, they, they look the other way. They can't, I'm just this thing marching through. But with her, she would interact with these women and their children and such. And that was really cool. That was something that I'd never noticed before. And I've noticed it other times now when I've traveled with my wife, because my wife likes to sew and likes to do the crochet and do this stuff. And if we're in a place like Egypt, a little remote area in Egypt, and she's sitting out doing the crocheting, automatically she has something kind of in common with these women and things that are doing these crafts and such. And that's cool versus me, who, I don't quite exude that kind of a vibe, I guess, which on purpose for the most part. But so that was cool with her there. And then getting to see how the women interacted with her. I saw something new and I enjoyed it.
Now, on these solo expeditions, you would use local people to assist you?
Yeah. And you know what? I used to use the word solo a lot, and I don't so much anymore, because the fact was I did use local people. But what I didn't do was, and I see it a lot now these days with these pseudo expeditions where you've got all these other people involved and you've got support staff that you're paying and you're doing all these things. What I would do was go village to village and hire someone to take me to the next village, carrying gear and such. I didn't hire some company to set up a trip and take me to here or there. It didn't go that way. In fact, no one I was ever with had been to the places, the long-term places we were going to go, like to the coast, for example. But I had a couple of guys that I took from the Highlands who one had some slight English because he would lead little tours around the village. He was a strong, tough guy, and we went together to the coast. So by solo, I want to be careful with that term. However, what I didn't do, none of this, I didn't sign up with some company or do anything like that. It was me, and it was my compass, my going south, my showing the route, and then having these guys assist. I'm not taking anything away from that. I would want to give credit to these guys that carried gear and did what they did. Interestingly enough, when you're in a place like New Guinea, if you're out on a long trek, what'll happen to you is you'll have a bunch of people carrying packs and such, and then at a certain point they stop. They're not going anymore. They can't, because they might be at war with that other tribe. And so then they back off, and then these new people will come on. So you could go, like if I'm out for weeks, I might have 5 or 6 different people carrying different things because they can't proceed due to the wars. It's a lot of wars there. But I want to give credit, I don't want to push the solo thing too much, because I did have villagers that certainly carried loads and did a lot that ensured the success. And that was a fascinating experience, witnessing that and witnessing how bushy some of these guys were, being able to, out in the middle of nowhere, build a jungle camp. To them, it was nothing with bamboo and whatever they could find by the side of a river to build a hut, to start a fire, to do all these things is quite amazing.
Now, you must have obviously spent a lot of time with them around the fire at night. What were the people like?
I had one guy that could speak slight English, Yesaya, who I think I was with on several trips, but most of them, not a word. I could speak a little bit of Indonesian. These were my guys, and I wanted to make sure I took care of them as best I could. And yet they were such a culture different than what I come from or what we come from. And an example was walking out of Wamena, walking up over the mountains. There's these people, these Highlanders, Wamena in the highlands of Indonesia, New Guinea is around 5,000 feet. Well, we were up in the mountains around 12,000 feet trying to cross the mountains. It's cold up there, and they weren't used to that. And I'll never forget it. As we were walking one day, and there's no jungle growth. It's just this real stunted high mountain type growth, small stunted palm trees and things. And all of a sudden, one of them drops his pack and runs, and he's got his head stuck in a hole. He's climbing into this hole. What the hell is this guy doing? And up above him, there's another little hole which you didn't see. This thing pops out. There was a little marsupial pops out. He didn't know that it had the escape hole. Well, then someone yells, and he comes backing out of the little hole his head was in, and he grabs that thing, and I think he brained it. And I'll never forget, he brained this poor thing. And then as he's holding it up, this little baby marsupial falls out of the little pouch. It's like, holy shit, what is going on here? And he takes it and puts it in a bag. We're still up around 13,000 feet. The Chakora Peak is to my right. It's 14,000 something. We make a cold camp and start a fire early. And my guys were all set up against a rock. There was a rock that had an angle, and they had all their wood. They collected wood, which I don't know where they got from up there, but they did enough wood and whatever to burn. And I'll never forget going over after I made my camp with my tent. I went over where they were, and they're starting their cooking and such. And there was blood all over the ground from this poor marsupial that they butchered, and they had it in a pan. But the strangest thing was that little baby marsupial. They had kind of crispy fried it, and I have photos of this. I'm just converting old slides now. That little he had his little tail, his little legs sticking out, and one of them had his back legs, and was eating him head first with his tail hanging out of his mouth, pushing this little dead, little cooked charbroiled marsupial into his mouth, eating it from the head first with the tail hanging out of his mouth. God damn, you don't see that very often.
Wonder what marsupial tastes like.
Yeah, well, especially, when you eat the whole thing, bones and all, legs and everything else. But he's pretty charred, so he probably was pretty crispy. But, they gave me a little bit of it, and I can't remember if I ate it or not. I tended to be careful with what I ate because I couldn't afford to get sick. You get sick out in a place like that. So I was always really careful with stuff. So I don't know if I ate it or if I passed it on. I had a few times where they would offer you food, and it's like, oh, God, that could be the end of me.
This is the time before GPS. I mean, I'm a map and compass guy myself, and jungle navigation is really hard. How'd you do it?
Well, I was trying to look up the Indonesian word for south. I think it's Selatan, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look on the internet. But basically, here is my navigation. I've got a compass. I'm looking to the south, and I know if we keep going south, we're going to hit the coast eventually. Now, I don't know. It's a long ways away, but just keep going that direction. So I would say, south, south, south. And we would work out because the trails and such that we were on going to villages, they don't always go south. They might go north, then go south. So God knows how circuitous we were going. But that's what it was all about. South, south, keep going south, and we'll finally hit the coast. And then we finally hit rivers once we got out of the mountains. And once we hit rivers, we know they empty into the sea. And I didn't really care. Anywhere they came out down there, I could navigate, to the Osmod area once I got there to the ocean. But that's how it was. Very, very primitive. No GPS.
So you come down from the highlands, down through the higher jungle forests into the swampy area. Is that how it came?
That's how it went. Yeah, you're 1 minute. Wamena is about 5,000. Nice kind of Colorado type feel to it. A little more tropical than Colorado than Denver or something. But then you're up 12,000, 13,000 feet, heading over the mountains. Then you end up on this rain side of the mountain, which is just wet, green, lush stuff, and then down into the swamp areas, which is fascinating once you get down into the swamps with the rivers and such and all the stuff that happens there with the different tribal people.
Tell us about the swamps. As you
Oh
come
gosh.
down and you start getting that swampy area, if we were standing by your side, what would we see?
Wow. Oh my God. I'll never forget this, Mike. My first trip, I was trying to get to the coast, wasn't successful. I mean, this is actually my fifth, but my first attempt to get from the highlands area in the interior of New Guinea down to the coast wasn't successful. I ended up across the mountains right. Everything was right there, but I hooked up with this indigenous group that were crocodile hunting. Well, they were going a little different direction. It kind of swung inland through the real swamps. It was so fascinating. I just said, hell with it. I'm just wherever I end up with these guys, I'm going. So I'm with these guys that are indigenous crocodile hunters. And my God, I'll never forget that. You're in this swampy area. You're going through this stuff. You get into these really, I don't know how they were navigating. I don't know, because it wasn't like this nice little stream. It turned into this area of where they would have to get out of the canoe and pull it through and cut brush and stuff. That was like that African Queen movie. It looked a lot like that. And they're cutting the brush, and we're getting through the swamps. We'd make camp in these things that would sit above the water on poles that must have been just communal. Anybody that's out there could stay in them, because it keeps you, you climb up a ladder and you're on this platform. And I'd put my tent, and then mosquitoes like you'd never could imagine, would come in, and they would be out hunting for crocodiles. And one night I'll never forget, I'm in my tent and I hear this noise. They're coming back from their hunt. I didn't go out with them tonight. And I hear them throw this thing up. It's crocodile. They threw him up next to the tent. He was still alive. He was tied up, thank God. But it was kind of, it's like, okay, kind of surprised me as, crocodile. And what was funny is they stayed, they were so happy they got this big crocodile. They stayed up all night and they butchered this thing. And there's a photo of me. It's a pretty cool photo in a canoe, a dugout. I had the guy just point the camera. He took a better photo than I could have ever taken. He's sitting in this canoe with my hat. But what it doesn't show is there's a big kind of bucket thing behind me, and I'm leaning. A crocodile head is actually behind me from that crocodile from the night before. But the swamps, man, those things, you get down there, they are incredible. I could really spend some time out there. You don't know if those things go back, a million years. God knows what all is out there.
What type of wildlife other than the crocs did you see?
Oh, heck, snakes, birds. New Guinea is really, really known for birds. People that are into birds, love the place because it has these incredible species like the bird of paradise and such, which are just amazing. Oh, and then the cassowaries, which are probably in that room here, have a cassowary is very similar to an ostrich, but not quite as large. A very dangerous bird. They've got these big toes, like I said, not quite as big as an ostrich, but big enough to where they have been known to kick, and they're strong enough to where they could really, they have killed people before by, a quick kick to somebody hunting them. Big bird, the cassowary, they have those in the interior. Lizard snakes. If you're into insect life, there's probably a million species that haven't been yet classified that would be there. It just teems with life, and that's what I love about the jungle. It just teems with life from every angle.
And before people get the wrong impression, I mean, this isn't Club Med. If you're down there in the jungle, there's got to be the humidity itself has got to be a killer.
Yeah. I mean, you're in a situation where you're soaked, all day long. I got pretty good with my clothing. I learned on my first trip through the Kokoda track in Papua New Guinea. I learned a lot about clothing. I learned what worked and what didn't work and stuff. And that basically you're going to get soaking wet. That is going to happen. It's just how the kind of clothes that you can have where you can dry out, especially at night, is you don't want to be with, especially wet boots are a bad thing. I got a kind of a trench foot thing that from my first trip through the Kokoda track years ago that stayed with me for a long time. My feet were in bad shape from that. And I didn't realize how bad it could get, but it got to be when I was done, I'd finished that track. I almost couldn't walk. My feet were in such bad shape. I learned from that experience. But no, it's I think most people would find it quite miserable, hot. You could have an absolute downpour like most people have never experienced. At any time, you could be walking through mud that's up to your knees. You're crossing streams that God knows what's in there as you're crossing these things. I think most people would probably find it somewhat unpleasant.
To say it mildly.
No, I didn't, but I did too. I shouldn't say that. Of course, you go, what the hell's wrong? What you end up thinking this is a good thing to do.
Well, it reminds me, I was down in Borneo. There was a section we were doing paddling around on the ocean from one island to the small one. And it was just, we'd been going for days. Back hurt, you got everything going, not enough food. And you're feeling, miserable. And all of a sudden I looked around and go, it was about sunset. And I looked around and go, man, I'm in the South China Sea. And all of a sudden it just makes it all worth it.
Yeah, Mike. And what I always try to tell myself, and I've done this anywhere I've been in the world, is I try to picture where I am on a globe. And I just think, wow, I am here. I'm standing in this spot, whether it was, New Guinea or Borneo or these are the places I've been or out in the Pacific Islands or the South Pole. Just picture where you are and then picture from above, where you are on the planet. How cool is that?
What did you learn on those expeditions through New Guinea?
Well, you said something the other day that when we were just talking about this, that I thought about later and it hit me, and I wouldn't have really thought about this in that way. And that I was responsible for these teams of men moving through the jungle and doing what we were doing. I was responsible for them. And this was probably, now I'd been a Marine many years earlier and I had done some things working and such, but I had these guys' lives in my hands in a way. And I remember one fellow, Josiah from the Highlands, picking a guy to go with us, another Highlander. And he picked his cousin. I think it would have been his cousin, Yelus. And I asked him at one point, why did you pick Yelus? Because he's strong, because he can carry? And he said, no, because if he dies, I won't have problems with the family if he dies. Because it wouldn't have an issue. Another family might have wanted God knows what, but because they're related. And that was why poor Yelus got chosen to come with us. Basically, he was more expendable. But the fact is, people aren't expendable. And I remember with these guys bringing these Highlanders down to the coast and they got malaria, and having them on the coast, they're Highlanders. They weren't exposed to this type of a thing. And now they're both down. One went down first and then the other. And I've got them in these kind of bed things. They're covered. They're sweating. I'm giving them the medication that I can give them, trying to get them through this thing. And I'm responsible for it. I caused it. I'm the reason they're down there. I'm the reason they had malaria. I'm the reason. And, we nursed them back to health. I got them back to the Highlands and such, but it really hit me, the level of responsibility. And it was something I never forgot. You won't feel stuff like that working in some insurance office with the people that are sitting out there in their cubicles and such, maybe, but goddamn, where I've been in the world, I have. And you take care of people. And it was something that I saw that what I did had an impact. And I needed to do my best to take care of these fellows.
You are a student of leadership, I understand, and you've made a real study of this. What are the qualities that make a good expedition leader? Well,
recently, some time ago, I was in a kind of a Facebook thing that I didn't really like being in, but it had to do with where I saw there was something I wouldn't even term an expedition, something that occurred in South America, which to me was a hokey thing that had been done before, and it wasn't any big deal. But these people had gotten together, and it had kind of fallen apart. And by the time it was done, the leader was upset because he wasn't being recognized as the leader. And my feelings were, hey, if you're not the leader, if they don't think you're the leader, then you're not the leader. But you look at expeditions where people are in truly peril. And you can then do comparisons between the South Pole is one of the best, where you've got a Robert Falcon Scott, you've got a Roald Amundsen, you've got an Ernest Shackleton. And in general, Ernest Shackleton is hands down considered this great leader. Shackleton had his flaws too. If you really read, you really get into some of the things they all did. But what's number one? Caring about your people more than you care about yourself. You have to. You take care of your people come first. If you have a little bit of food left, your people get that food. You take care of them first. There's other things that you have to do that, to get into my South Pole, what happened there and the experience I had. But the point is that, you'll hear it in the business world, take care of your people. Well, I don't know what that means. You give them pay raises, you pat them on the back, you say good job with what you did in your cubicle today. But if you're out there and somebody's carrying stuff across a mountain and they're facing poisonous snakes and crocodiles and such like that, it becomes a whole different thing. And you really take care of them, and you make sure that they come first. That's something I learned.
Of all the historical expedition leaders, who do you admire most?
Well, personally, I mean, I have an affinity for Burton. I'm looking at a bust of Richard Francis Burton up here because I understand him the most. I understand what he did and how he thought, because I think some similarities in thinking. But the fact of the matter is, in studying this and looking at people, I would go back to this. Most of these famous explorers that this house is a monument to, by the way, it's a monument to these guys. What's in this house, to these famous Victorian type explorers. You'll find the common thread with most of them. They're egomaniacs, and they were out hell bent for fortune and glory. And that's what they were out to do. And for some of them, it meant little what happened to people along the way, what happened to others in their great quest. But if you look at Dr. David Livingstone, who spent his life in Central Africa and basically gave his life doing what he did in suppression of the slave trade. And the fact that somehow this old man could move through these tribal groups, and they left him alone. They let him go, and he would go through and he'd get in these areas that a guy like Henry Morton Stanley, who I greatly, greatly admire, had to shoot his way through these areas. But Livingstone didn't. What made the difference? The guy was a religious fellow and a medical doctor, but he brought some aura with him that where he didn't need the violence and such that occurred with some of the Victorian era explorers. So I admire him greatly for what he did, and the fact that he had such a passion to try to eradicate the heinous slave trade, that was raging through Africa at that time.
Something just occurred to me when you were talking about Burton, because if I remember from his biography, most of his travels, his experiences were pretty much on his own. He wasn't part of any big, except for maybe going for the source of the Nile. But, when he was in India, when he was in the Middle East, he was usually on his own. And your travels are a lot like that, where when you say solo, you're on your own in as far as Western connections, but you're relying on local resources. Do you think that way of traveling, although much more dangerous for a number of reasons, do you think that you experience the area and the people in a different, maybe better way?
Well, I think I just can't get anyone that will go with me, quite frankly. The thing is that there's something to when you're alone, truly alone, that I enjoy, and the South Pole is where it got intensified times 100 being alone. That was a whole different story. But on my travels, Burton, you're right. Burton was almost always alone. And I would say this about Burton: he wasn't a great leader. He didn't lead. If you look at his history, it wasn't as a leader. He was this swashbuckling, larger-than-life character. But if you look at it, though, the few times he was in a leadership role, whether it was on the coast of Somalia where his camp got overrun and these guys killed, or whether it was the mess with John Hanning Speke, when Speke claimed the source of the Nile, when he, did his thing and left Burton for a few days, it became a disaster, a catastrophe. So Burton was more of a solo flyer. I am too, quite frankly. But, I do enjoy. And here's a funny story. One thing I did talk about is 1987, I went down to Irian Jaya to New Guinea. That was my first trip to the Indonesian side. And I'm on this aircraft, and this little one, we're going down into the Wamena area, and I've got all my gear ready to be good heading out in the jungle, got kind of a plan. And I meet these two German fellows on the aircraft. And hey, these guys look the part of hardened explorers. They had the cool khaki shirts with the epaulets. And as we were talking on the aircraft, they told me they just come back from a trip to the Amazon jungle, and they were going to be filming. They were going to do a video documentary down in New Guinea, and then after we talked, they wanted to know, do I want to be part of it? Well, not only was that part of it, I set it up. I set up that we would get to this place up in the high plateau. We would start the trek from there. I worked it out with the people that had this small Cessna to get us up that high, and then we would walk from there and head out. Well, you really need to check out people more before you head out in a place like that with them, because We got up on this place called Quiawagi in the high plateau, and it rained. I mean, it rained and rained torrentially. I had this beautiful North Face tent, and other than a little bit of dampness, I'd seam sealed it, and it was, I spent a good night. But I could hear the Germans screaming during the night, and the word Wasser came up a lot. Wasser, Wasser, water's coming as it's pouring through the tent. Well, I should have known. The tent was this cheap orange thing that should never, it was not an expedition-style tent. And when I got up in the morning, I was horrified to see that one of the German sleeping bags was a Mickey Mouse. It actually had Mickey Mouse logo on the bag. As I got to, and then their gear was so heavy because it was so wet, no one would carry it because it weighed, now the sleeping bag weighed 50 pounds soaking wet. So the whole thing was a debacle. It was a debacle, but it was a funny debacle. They didn't have all the right gear, but they carried enormous amounts of chocolate. I really like chocolate. So there was a redeeming, feature. And the things that occurred with these guys was so humorous that I was only with them for a while, and then they stopped. They found there was an aircraft going out of a village, and they flew back, and I kept going. But I'd never had a funny time like that before, watching these guys. Well, one incident wasn't funny, but the majority of the time with them, it was actually amusing to see these guys that should have never been out there. And when they finally fessed up to their Amazon trip, where they had gone to, it was a big city on the coast of the Amazon. They had told the local population that they were photographers for the German version of Playboy magazine. So attracted young ladies for photo session in their room, and their jungle was probably out back behind the hotel that they had done. So they were truly charlatans. And for the most part, it was, I had some fun. But later they showed me the video they took. And I was my part in the video is like in the background. You kind of see me in one scene sort of in the back and this and that. And they're doing this thing where one of them is crossing this river, and it looks like George Washington crossing the Potomac. And I don't know what they're saying. It's all in German, but it was absolute bullshit. And it really taught me something about what happens with these expeditions and how I would call very few things that are occurring these days true expeditions. But that was an absolute, I wouldn't call it catastrophe because I found it so funny, but it was an experience about being with other people, that with pros and cons. It's not easy to be in some of these situations with other people sometimes. In this case, it was so amusing, it was worthwhile.
Plus the chocolate.
Plus the chocolate. It was all about these big blocks of chocolate. It's really good.
Always be careful who you rope up to.
Oh, God, you know that as a climber.
Let me ask a little bit more serious question, because you've put it out there quite a few times. What is the closest that you came to maybe have gone too far? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's an interestingly worded question. And it was fairly interesting. When I came back from the Amazon, I remember my father-in-law at the time, because it was a mess. And of course they thought I was dead, and it could cause a little bit of problems and such. And when I came back, he said to me, "Does this take a little wind out of your sails?" I said, "Are you kidding? I'm heading back as soon as I can." There wasn't, I felt bad about that. And I feel worse today, much worse now than I did back then. It's funny how the years have changed the feelings on that disaster. But there was a thing that happened once when I was out on my third winter. That was my second winter. And the sun was starting to come up, and the wind was blasting. It was about 25 knots. It's probably minus 80, 70 something, 80. And it was blasting me in the face. And I was starting my daily walk. And I climbed up on this little ice hill while it was hitting me. And I thought, it kind of hit me. I thought, what in the hell am I doing? This is so far from no. I started laughing. And I'm glad no one was out there who would have seen me, because I was almost hysterically laughing, like, what the hell happened in life where I like this, where this is pleasant, where this is, the wind chill must have been 110 or something below. I was protected, but it kind of hit me, that little bit of, this is not really normal, but I was enjoying the shit out of it.
Yeah, that's the kind of times that you start to question your sanity. Then you have another scotch, look at the map, and go out again.
Sure. Yeah. It's all about that. It's these moments of clarity sometimes come, but never, never anything where I wouldn't have done what I've done. The thing too, Mike, is because we're just talking and we don't get into great detail on certain things. I'm a very careful individual, very, very careful. I'm very, very careful and cautious what I do. That doesn't mean I haven't pushed the envelope with doing things, but I'm not a daredevil. I never was. I wasn't the kid on the bicycle that flew over the house and did crazy stuff and all that. No way. I calculate things. I want to minimize risk as best I can. And I want to come back alive from anything that I've done. And I always assume that I will. But I'm careful and cautious, and I try not to do stupid things.
It's interesting you say that. I've interviewed now a number of people like you that go out on expeditions, various kinds. And one of the common themes is risk management. Just like you said, you don't be silly, you take measured risks, but you do everything in your power to prepare. Like the tent that you had with the scene.
Yeah.
Prepare so that you're not waking up with a bag full of, a Mickey Mouse bag that's full of water.
Full of water. Well, you prepare. I mean, you prepare, and that's something that I believe in. And to the point, another thing is physical fitness. I'm a runner. And I've logged in every mile I've run since about 1981. And so it's around, I don't know, I haven't, because the last couple of years I haven't even totalized them, but it's probably 45,000 or so miles of running. And I want to be fit and ready to go for anything. Now, unfortunately, with 45,000 miles of running, what I've done is develop some chronic injuries too. That's what happened. But the point is that I think it's important to be physically prepared for things. And so I always, particularly being a Marine too many years ago, I didn't ever want to get myself in a spot where I physically wasn't able to proceed, go farther, keep going. And I've never reached any kind of limit there. And I think that's important. Important to be careful, be cautious, not the daredevil.
What are your future plans? Do you have any expeditions on the horizon?
Well, I tell you what, I don't know if we're going to get into the South Pole stuff, but I completed 3 winters at the South Pole as the winter manager at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. That was a tremendous experience, and that experience is done now. I've completed that, and happy that it's finished. And I have another job out in the Kwajalein, out in the Marshall Islands Pacific, that I'm supposed to head out to sometime in the fall. I would like to do some expeditionary plans, and of all things, I'd like to get back to New Guinea, to Indonesia, New Guinea, and see what's left there to do. But with the COVID thing, I need to be very cautious with that, because I don't know when they're going to open these things up, and I also don't want to be the one that exposes some tribal people to this shit, and so I'll have to proceed cautiously with that. So I have the job out in the Marshall Islands, and if I can't do any expeditionary things due to the COVID, Marshall Islands, if I do that, there's some interesting Pacific cultural things that I love the Pacific, and I love the culture of the Pacific Islands. So I'll probably concentrate on that.
What is it like to be at the South Pole in that area?
It's cold. People ask me about that, what my draw was at. And quite frankly, if you look at my house, I do have a polar room in the back dedicated to polar explorers. But personally, I like warm. I like warmth. I like the tropics. I love the jungle. I love all that stuff. But what drew me to the South Pole, to that program, was the great struggle that occurred during what was known as the heroic age of exploration. And the great struggle, with Roald Amundsen, Captain Scott, Ernest Shackleton, and, what happened for these men, and the different techniques and the different leadership styles that they used to try to get to the South Pole was a fascinating thing for me. So some years ago, I ended up being selected as a winter manager at the South Pole. And for viewers, winter at the South Pole is most of the year, starting from February all the way into November. And we would deploy early, so we were there a year at a time. So I was there almost 3 years in total at the South Pole, and through 3 dark winters. When someone asks what it's like, I'll always just tell them that it was cold. because there's a million other things I could say, have to be more specific.
It's a vast expanse of white, obviously, from all the ice. For someone who's used to jungle green or being up in the mountains, how do you get used to just seeing just white?
Yeah. Listen, Mike, that's a good question, because people, a lot of times, most people that have been to Antarctica, whether it was on an Antarctic cruise or whether they worked at McMurdo Station or one of the coastal stations, that's what they know. The mountains, the sea life, the sea life that they have there, the killer whales, all those cool things. The pole doesn't have anything like that. It's an ice cap, a flat ice cap, nearly 1,000 miles, around there is nothing. That appeals to me. I also do have an affinity with the desert, with this vast nothingness, and that ice cap is truly, it's devoid of life other than us. But see, then that brings up another thing, and I reached an interesting point in my life where this became very important to me, and that was leadership and interaction with other people. Because while we didn't have the animal life, while we were cut off like we are for most of the year from the rest of the world, it was a chance to test out my own leadership style and take care of 3 South Pole winter crews. That was fascinating. I didn't need to look at whales and seabirds and things.
What'd you learn?
I learned that my style worked, that the style that I developed for that, and I thought it out ahead of time on how I would be as a leader, and it worked. And we had 3 highly successful South Pole winters that I'm very proud of, those crews.
And now that station, just so folks know, it's a science station, is it not?
Yes, it is. The main thing is astronomical science. Has some incredible science going on there now with the IceCube neutrino laboratory, the South Pole telescope, the Marvin Pomerantz Observatory, and the Arrow that the NOAA runs for weather and climate type data gathered there. So, yeah, it's the main thing. The main reason for the South Pole Station is just that, science, and to be part of that and be the station manager in charge of keeping that together through a dark and cold South Pole winter was, to me, a absolute honor to lead those crews, those wonderful people.
And it has to be a challenge for the psychological effects of the isolation and the cold and the dark.
Absolutely. And that's what my book goes into a bit, particularly my isolation, because I isolated myself as a leader from the crew in a lot of ways. And I did it for their own good. It was best. I know what worked. I know what didn't work in the past. And so I was incredibly alone while I was there. At the same time, I hope incredibly responsive to taking care of them. They were more important than anything to me. Their health and welfare always came first. But it's a true test of leadership, and different styles have been used, from I'm everybody's buddy, which doesn't work, to hands off, let it run itself, which might work with the right crew. My style was different. I melded a love of history, where I did historical presentations to my crew, where the crews knew that they were thing that's always important to me is who came before us. Let's acknowledge those people, Roald Amundsen, Captain Scott, Ernest Shackleton. So I would bring things from my personal collection. I would have movie nights, and we would talk about, to the interested people anyway, about those people that had come before us. That was really important to me. And then the next thing that I did was develop the crew concept. And they'd kind of laugh sometimes. My crews would laugh, but for each one of them, I'd always say, like, you are the 2017 South Pole Winter Crew. You are the only 2017 South Pole Winter Crew there will ever be. This is it. You are it. And each crew knew that. When we came back from that, we have a patch. A patch is made. It's like a space mission. Those people from my years, 2017, 2019, 2020, I wanted them to feel the pride of what they did and what they did, spending a year of their life at the South Pole, and to feel good about the experience and what they had learned and how they had interacted with other crew members. And it's very, very important to me that they experienced and they appreciated the great gift we were all given to be at the South Pole for a year.
Outstanding. And it's got to be, and I can see it in your face, just the pride that you have in those 3 years of being part of that.
Yeah, Mike, there's nothing like it. These other things I did, I consider fairly minor after that. It was very interesting. I remember my first year when the station was closing, and one of the people that was leaving said, "Well, Wayne, get ready for the greatest adventure of your life." And I laughed at that time, because I'd been through some adventures, some hair raising, no shit, real deal adventures. And I didn't think, the South Pole would be it, but it was in a different way. It was taking care of these crews. And then being so alone too, which my leadership style kind of had, utilized that as to have a little bit of I had a gulf between myself and my crews, which I love these people, but I needed to maintain that gulf to maintain what I needed to do for their own good. There's nothing quite like it on the planet, though. There's, we have numbers. I'm 1,522. That's around 1,600 people have wintered at the South Pole. Over 5,000 have climbed Mount Everest. And I wouldn't put the two things, they're totally different things. But the winter crew members that have done that, they have a number. They're very proud of it. And I wanted my crews to be exceptionally proud of what they did. Tried to keep them on track so they would be. Because some years, not so much. You'll see.
Do you look back, or have you taken time to reflect that maybe all of these expeditions, all of these remote postings as a defense contractor, things that you've experienced basically prepared you for those 3 years in the Antarctic?
Yeah. Yes, Mike. And I was thinking about that when you mentioned that when I think about my expeditions and my guys with malaria, for example, seeing the effects of what I had done and doing what I could to, get these guys back to health and get these guys home, or 20 years working around the world through 2 wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, Wake Island, Saudi Arabia, Midway Atoll, Shemya Island, Alaska, Ascension Island, South Atlantic. I was in some pretty remote sites around the world. And so it came at the right time. And no one's a perfect leader, but I learned some things that worked and I learned things that didn't work. And for example, I'm having a nice scotch tonight, but for a year, I wouldn't have a drink. When I'm with my crews, I'd have a drink at the end. When we're done, we all get together and I have a drink because I'm on duty every night. It's all on me. Anything happens. And there can never be the thought that, one thing led to another. The station manager was drinking. That's happened in the past. I would never have that. And I wanted to make my crew very aware that I wanted them to have a good time. There is alcohol there. But for me, I was on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I had the weight of the world on my shoulder. I mean, we had the COVID crisis. To be there at the South Pole had pressures that I hadn't felt in the 2 years prior. And so it's nice to have a scotch here back in Texas, that's for sure.
Wayne, it's been a pleasure. I know you've got a lot more stories, and I hope we can bring you back in the future. So tell us some more. I would love to hear more about that trips through Zululand and also in the Amazon. Yeah.
Those would be good, Mike, for the future. Those are kind of their own things once I put some things together I'm converting old slides and old negatives that I haven't seen in many years to, digital format. And that'd be something we might want to talk about in the future.
Definitely. Now, in the meantime, is there any way for people to follow your work and what you're doing?
Well, probably the Facebook. My Instagram thing is very primitive. I'm going to be setting up a website because of the book that I've written. I'm signing a deal with a publisher this week, but I would say, Facebook, I post everything publicly on there. So anybody, Wayne White can find me. Maybe, I don't know how you do the search engine thing for Facebook, but please, take a look. I'm near my 5,000 friend limit. So sometime I've got to do some, I got to figure that out a little bit on how that, keep that number manageable.
Nice. All right, Wayne. It's been a real honor. It's been a real pleasure, and I think I might go find a drink myself for tonight.
Sounds good, Mike. Thanks. It was really fun talking to you, and thanks for the opportunity. I hope people enjoy this.
I'm sure they will. Cheers, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again. Share a glass of whiskey and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhart.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.